The vast majority of people in the world are represented by governments who do not perceive not only Palestinian armed resistance, Lebanese armed resistance, Yemeni armed resistance, Iraqi armed resistance. They don't perceive it as, not only do they not perceive it as a greater evil, they don't perceive it as evil.
British Iraqi rapper and pro-Palestine activist Kareem Dennis, better known as Lowkey, has been a powerful and influential pro-Palestinian voice before and during the conflict.
Israel continues down a path in which it becomes a pariah state, and it seems like it might be going down that path. What happens to people like this? What can people do in generally to kind of bring these things to light? Welcome to another episode of the PalPulse podcast. Today with us we have a rapper, activist, journalist, host of the Watchdogs podcast, and an all-round, active member of the community. He's advocated for the survivors and victims of Grenfell, and most notably, he's been active on the Palestine scene quite heavily in the last recent months. Welcome, Lowkey.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.
I want to start with kind of the plethora of things you've done throughout your career. You started as a rapper, and those who know you've been quite vocal about injustice, even in your early days. And you've kind of transitioned into more of an activist and now a journalist as well. So I'd like you, if you could take us through that journey.
Well, I think I was quite fortunate in some ways because I was given some form of political education as a young person through my parents and through their individual experiences and their own backgrounds. I do think the thing that ultimately pushed me even further towards trying to be an agent of change of some kind within this society were the circumstances that I was growing up in. So while their stories, their traumas, their upbringings obviously had an effect on me and sit within my memories in a strong way, then being in a society where you obviously had the first Gulf War, you then had the war in 2003 on Iraq, and the way that the state that you live within adopts a hostile stance towards people that you feel an affinity with and you feel you are part of. And then you have to find a way to try and square a circle, which is to be effective in some way, find a tangible way to be effective. And I think the key thing to understand about our system is a lot of it is based on the abstraction of politics. So what I mean by that is, for example, you are given ways to participate in decision-making in the society which are quite distant and indirect. So, for instance, we all grew up with the marches, we all grew up with the protests. In many ways, they helped form who we were, how we saw these causes that we care deeply about and that move us emotionally. But during that time, you begin to realize that what you're hoping to do is march on the street and then that affect what happens within the parliament. And so obviously the Grenfell fire, which happened next door to me, which a friend of mine died in, you start to realize that these are abstractions. You're not able to directly affect the material equation here. And we have quite a carefully curated and managed avenue of political possibility in the country. And actually, when you look at, say, the war in Iraq, you look at Corbyn, you look at Gaza, and you look at Grenfell, all of those things which have deeply affected my own movement throughout politics, they are the hardest edges of the political system. They are almost non-negotiables within what we understand to be the way decision is administered here. And so therefore you have to find other ways to affect it. And culturally speaking, through music, you do have the potential to launch a war of attrition of sorts, where you are able to affect different generations and inculcate them with particular views around these issues. And then that can affect things. But it's quite hard to measure and quantify. The other side is direct action, which we can get into also, because Palestine Action is a key part of this development, where you realize that ultimately the door is closed to most, if not all, of the ways that you've been given to be politically active. So you begin to attempt different ways to affect that situation. And so for me, obviously social media was a massive change in all of that. Previous to social media, I would sell CDs on the side of the street as a teenager. I would go to open mics. You get into battles and stuff like that. And that's one way of expressing yourself and getting yourself known as an artist. But then with the different social media eras, from MySpace to then Facebook, YouTube, and now Twitter and Instagram, they lend themselves to different forms of communication. So whereas with MySpace, you'd upload a song on there. So for instance, I remember a song called Long Live Palestine. I put it up on MySpace in 2009. And at that stage, it started getting like 15,000 listens a day. And that was a big deal at that time. It's like, okay, people are now, we're reaching people and people are interacting with the message. But then when it comes to Facebook, it lends itself to more expression. And so you're writing statuses and generally having a kind of a place in people's daily life and imagination. But then when it comes to this, and obviously after studying and stuff like that, you become a little bit more curious and you investigate a bit more. And particularly with what we've been subjected to in this country, you have to remember we have been, as a community and as communities within that community, have been subject to very, very serious operations by foreign actors and by domestic actors. We are a target population. What goes on in our mind and the way we perceive what's happening in the world is a contested space. It's something that a lot of people are paying a lot of money to try and influence. And so when you've been subjected to all of this, when you've gone through the attempt to go in through Downing Street with Corbyn, when you've gone through seeing your neighbours killed right next door to you, and not only does the state not criminalise the people responsible for it, it criminalises the community you come from. So when those things happen to you, you're pushed and forced more and more into a corner in terms of what actions you can take to change it. And ultimately, for me, stepping away was not an option. And I viewed it overall as something that if you have the influence to some extent, then you really do have a responsibility to use it in those kind of situations. And you can't just become insular in that way. You have to be part of the society and part of forming the society. So, these are all of them are manifestations, whether you're talking about the music or the politics or the journalism, it's just manifestations of the same thing, trying to achieve impossibilities within a political system which tells you that the door is closed, basically.
You mentioned Palestine Action.
Yeah.
I'd like you to briefly touch on what they're about and what they've achieved so far and kind of what their latest achievements are.
So, since Palestine Action was founded, and the main target, but not the only target, has been Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms company. It produces 85% of the drones that Israel uses. It was involved in the building of the apartheid wall across the West Bank. It manufactures the majority of the small arms that Israel uses. Since the beginning of Palestine Action, you've seen 77 investors pull out of Elbit Systems. You've seen 3 sites of this arms company shut down permanently in this country. That's the head office in London, that was a subsidiary in Oldham for Anti-Technologies, and a subsidiary in Tamworth, Elite KL. In addition to that, you have seen £280 million worth of contracts cancelled between the British Ministry of Defence and Elbit Systems. You've seen many of the other companies that had deals with Elbit Systems also cancel their contracts, whether it was a logistics company or it was the recruitment company, IO Associates. In addition to that, the website designer dumped Elbit Systems. And actually, at one point, Elbit Systems UK, the official UK subsidiary, is the value of its shares dropped by 20%, which is quite considerable. It's considerable. But over the last year or so, you've seen an 11% drop in the value of shares in Elbit Systems. Now, Palestine Action is about disabling the ability of this company to function in this country.
So Elbit is the main target.
Elbit's the main target. There are other targets, of course, and companies that do business with Elbit are also targets, and legitimate targets, in my view, on several levels. Number one, according to the Arms Trade Treaty, which Britain is a signatory and ratifier of, Britain should not make exports to countries if they have reason to believe that they may be used, those exports, for violations of international humanitarian law. So therefore, the business secretary should not rubber stamp those exports. And by our estimation, the export of arms is the most vulnerable part of the Zionist project today. Because when you bring the case, and this was the lesson from the Raytheon 9, who I've been very fortunate to meet some of them, in Derry, in the north of Ireland, during the Israeli campaign in Lebanon in 2006, you had a group of local people who took it upon themselves to shut down the arms factory for Raytheon, which is the second largest arms company in the world. It was producing weapons in Derry and sending them to Israel and being used on Lebanon. Now, the individuals involved in that case, they shut down the factory and stayed there and were then taken out by the police and prosecuted. When they entered the court as the accused, but they left as the accusers. Because what happens is, when you present a jury and even a judge, in many cases with Palestine Action, you have to remember, and this is significant, people have walked free from magistrates' courts, which almost never happens. The case has been presented to a judge in which they say, this is what the hardware from this factory is used for, and therefore any actions that I have taken were to prevent the greater harm. Now, that has been found to be a majority of the times a convincing argument in these cases. And that is the reason why, despite repression by the British state, despite the Israeli embassy lobbying the CPS on this issue, specifically Palestine Action, despite figures from the media actually attempting to infiltrate the organization and then getting people arrested, the cases are either dropped in many times before they get to trial, the cases are dropped, but once they go to trial, the majority of cases, people are leaving and Israel's being brought into the court. And so ultimately, Elbit, as a company, really has more interest in keeping what it does outside of British courts, because then you are potentially turning these jurors against Israel and what it does in Gaza. You're increasing awareness about what they're doing. And so for me, this is an antidote to the abstraction of politics. It's an antidote to this idea that people do something here and it affects something here. Well, we're going directly there and we're affecting this. And so, I say it, objectively speaking, there's never been anything like Palestine Action in this country, and the achievements of Palestine Action are unprecedented. And so I think it's vital that people support Palestine Action in any way they can, and there's many different ways that people can support them. It would not require everyone to go and take part in an action. There's other ways that they can support the organisation.
So Elbit is able to operate in this country even though the British government is a signatory to treaties which should disallow it from operating in this country. So it seems that there is some sort of political, I don't know to say corruption, or at least some sort of influence.
Absolutely, yeah. It's baked into the system, yeah. It's a key element of the system, yeah. So
speaking of politics, we are now in the midst of a general election, a campaign for general election, and it's recently been reported that Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, has or is going to adopt, at least seemingly, a policy of recognising a state of Palestine. And this goes against something he previously said, I think, as well, which goes against what previous Labour leader has promised. So what do you think is going on there? And where do you think this will lead us?
So my estimation as a student of the issue is that what you have currently is Israeli military rule over all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. What you have is pockets of resistance within Palestine, which is linked to the wider regional equation of resistance. Zionism as an imposition is an attempt to square a circle. Imposing a foreign settler colonial population on the people of Palestine has been proven over almost a century, well, more than a century really if you look at the advent of the Zionist movement, to be against the will of the population in the region. Now, the idea of statehood within that equation has on one hand served as a very useful subterfuge on the Israeli side, but it's a particular side of the Israeli political and military elite. It's not the side which is represented by Netanyahu and Likud. So now there's a lot of talk about the phrase from the river to the sea. But what many forget is that in the Likud party platform, they say explicitly, word for word, there will be no Palestinian sovereignty between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They state very clearly their position on that. Now, the other side of the Israeli political elite, which you have to remember comes from the Ben-Gurion part of the Zionist movement. Benjamin Netanyahu's father was a close aide to Vladimir Jabotinsky. Now, a lot of us assume that the most loved and respected figure in the Zionist movement would be Theodor Herzl. We're told he was the founder of Zionism, and to some extent that's true. But this is someone that died in 1904 or 1905, depending on the testimony that you read. But at the time of his death, Herzl was somebody that accepted the Uganda plan. So it was an alternative to Palestine. The World Zionist Congress was against it, but he was in acceptance of that. I mean, you have to remember also with Herzl that ethnic cleansing and expulsion of, well, not ethnic cleansing, expulsion of Palestinians was always deemed to be a necessity for the setting up of this entity. In his book, he writes, we should find ways to spirit the penniless population across the borders. And that's what Israel has excelled at. It's innovated new ways of spiriting the penniless population across the border, as Herzl said. But the wing of the Zionist movement, which is represented by the Ehud Barak, the Yair Lapid, the Benny Gantz, is more closely linked to Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion's position during the British Mandate was that they would work with the British to obtain their objectives. The Jabotinsky side, and the kind of ironic thing about it is that both Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion were trained in the British Army in World War I. And they were with Herbert Samuel's son. Herbert Samuel was the first British High Commissioner of Palestine after the establishment of the mandate, and had he was tasked with applying the Balfour Declaration. And it was the application of the Balfour Declaration which actually set up the structure of the apartheid system. It established separate institutions depending on religious identity, meaning that Jewish settlers, part of what they call in Hebrew the Yeshuv, which literally means settlement. This is how the Zionist community were referred to before the founding of the entity, the state. So Ben Gurion viewed it as the wisest policy to collaborate with the British. And that collaboration led to some interesting choices.
Right.
There were times when the British were saying we need to temper immigration.
The white paper.
Of Zionists. Yes, exactly. We need to temper it somewhat. And so Ben Gurion's taking positions that from another Zionist perspective are seen as traitorous. In some cases, there's deals being made, 1933, the Havara Agreement. There's deals being made that in some way both sides look at. And the amazing thing when you read some of the ways that Zionist leaders spoke about each other is they're able to express themselves far more than we are here.
Right.
They would refer to each other as Nazis as a regular thing. Whereas obviously, here there's numerous ways in which our speech is restricted on this issue of Zionism. But to get to the point, because this is quite a long-winded answer that I'm giving you, is the Jabotinsky side, which is manifested in Netanyahu, and even further right, the Kahanist side, which is Ben Gvir and Smotrich. It's completely non-negotiable, the idea of any type of PR exercise. And they know it's a PR exercise.
Yeah.
The mileage that has been gained off of the mirage of a Palestinian state, what has that mean? That's meant that you increase the amount of settlers in the West Bank to almost 700,000 now. The initial stages, when this was being discussed from Camp David to Oslo, you had a minimal amount of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and in Gaza. In Gaza, there were only ever something like 8,000. So even the attempt that what they're attempting to do in Gaza now is unprecedented. What these organizations that are part of the Israeli government, and in some cases even funded by branches of the US government, are discussing vis-a-vis Gaza, it's never been done before. You're not going to fill up Gaza with Israeli settlers. It's not going to happen. But, they're fantastical. They have maximalist fantasies. And ultimately, they believe that these things are for the greater good. And in this case, what you have is the well-funded PR exercise of the two-state solution, which has allowed the extension of Zionism in the way that it has done. You've set up an outsourced Palestinian contractor, which is the Palestinian Authority, which is, as we speak, jailing, killing, and torturing Palestinians for resisting Israel, which works lock in step with Israel, which in and of itself is outsourced to the British government. So who is it that trains and arms the Palestinian Authority? It's the British government. And that even is outsourced even further to this organization, Adam Smith International, which is full of former British intelligence personnel and is contracted by the British government to train the Palestinian Authority. So there's several degrees of separation which allows an obfuscation about responsibility. Bankrolled by the EU, bankrolled by the United States, overseen by the CIA. That's what the two-state solution has meant. And what you now have is the Saudis, the UAE, the United States, and the Ben-Gurionite wing of the Zionist movement working on repackaging what's happened and finding a way out of this, what they see as a PR disaster, which is the genocide in Gaza. And so they're trying to find a way in which they can, and Labour, you can't trust a single thing that the Labour Party says it believes. Everything, even on a domestic level, from student loans to everything that Keir Starmer has said he will do to this so-called national energy company, which actually will be a PFI thing, he goes back on anyway.
Yeah.
So even if we did view the founding of a state, and let's be clear, the Palestinian Authority is riding high right now internationally.
Wow.
Because it's able to present itself as the solution.
Even though they've been trained to police and imprison and torture Palestinians.
So they're able to present themselves as a solution in two ways, and I'll explain. So from the diplomatic side of things, they're able to say to the Gulf and to the United States, to Britain, we are your only hope at legitimacy for your project here. We will give a Palestinian face to your policy here.
Yeah.
For Palestinian consumption and for local consumption, frankly speaking, because we understand that all of the resistance factions in Gaza, some of which are not proscribed entities in this country, have received billions over the decades from Iran. So what the Palestinian Authority is able to say, what happened in Gaza is your Iranian project. That's your muqawama. Yeah. What's happening in the West Bank, it may not be ideal, but it's not Gaza.
Yeah.
So that's what the Palestinian Authority is able to use in its argument, both on the Palestinian side and on the diplomatic side. And so for that reason, they are meeting daily with the Saudis, with the UAE, with the British government. They're trying to find a way out of this in a way that can maintain appearances. And like I say, their star has risen. They think it's their time. They're wrong. They're wrong because they are underestimating the popularity of the resistance factions in not only in the region but in the whole entire world. From Colombia to Brazil to India, all over the world, people perceive those resisting Zionism in the region and US rule in the region as the pinnacle of humanity. The vast majority of people in the world are represented by governments who do not perceive not only Palestinian armed resistance, Lebanese armed resistance, Yemeni armed resistance, Iraqi armed resistance. They don't perceive it as, not only do they not perceive it as a greater evil, they don't perceive it as evil.
Right.
They perceive it as inherently good. Okay? And that is reflected, and I'm not just saying that in a whimsical way. I'm saying if you were to break down per government who designates Palestinian resistance factions, you'd find, okay, fine, the British government. Okay, it's supposed to represent maybe 67 million people. Okay, the US government, so it represents 360 million people. Okay, the Israeli government, the Israeli entity, I mean, who does that represent? You have wildly ranging different arguments about how many human beings it represents. The EU, let's take it, the biggest, okay, Japan, less than 1 billion people. Less than 1 billion people in the world are represented by governments that designate Palestinian resistance factions in that way. Okay. What about the government of Turkey? What about the government of Brazil? What about the government of China? Ostensibly represents 1.4 billion people. What about the government of Russia? What about the government of Iran? What about the government of Venezuela? The vast majority of humanity are represented by governments who do not designate Palestinian resistance factions in that way. The vast majority of humanity perceive themselves as post-colonial subjects. They view decolonization as inherently a good thing. UN Resolution 3246 states clearly the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance. And that right will continue. That is the lesson from the history of the Zionist experiment in Palestine, is that at every single juncture, there has been resistance. You know, you look at them killing Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam in 1936. What happened? What happened? You had the longest strike in human history recorded by the Palestinians. At every single juncture where there has been greater repression, there has been resistance come back. You know, people should have by now relinquished their claims. If Zionism worked, if they were able to achieve their objectives, you wouldn't have anything like what you're happening now. What you're having happening now. Anything like it. Anything like it. And so it's going to become harder and harder and harder for them, because you win a war not just by killing the most vulnerable among the population of your enemy. You win a war by your ideas being the most convincing to the largest amount of people. And if that's the metric by which you measure this, then Israel has lost. The United States is going to bury its global supremacy with its settler colonial entity in Palestine. The writing is on the wall.
Right. With regards to the United States and the opposition to their hegemony, and obviously the way that the Zionist project is fundamentally interlinked to US interests. Now, there are some people who take the stance that not everywhere the US involves itself is it in the wrong. For example, when it calls out China for its treatment of the Uyghurs, when it calls out the Assad regime for the massacres it's committed upon the Syrian people. So what do you believe is kind of the correct way to look at this situation? Is it more nuanced than America bad and anywhere else good?
So, behind statements, what do we know about US history of what follows? A statement can be made about what's happening in your neighbor's house. But what are you doing that you're not saying? So in the case of China, for example, you have 400 US military bases surrounding that country.
Right.
You have constant attempts by the United States to back organizations to split up this ancient civilization that we're talking about. You know, the United States is a baby. It's a baby. It's a couple of 100 years old. When we're talking about other civilizations, whether it's in the Middle East or in the case of China, you're talking about 4,000, 5,000 years of civilization. You're talking about several stages of humanity in which it has been the most advanced political unit. You are talking about a place that had within it understandings of social mobility at a time when people in Western Europe, the forefathers of the United States, had absolutely nothing like that level of complexity of society. The Confucius exam system would allow people who began their life in the most horrid conditions to rise to working in the highest level of the society long before any of those understandings came to Western societies. There's no comparison, literally no comparison. And when you look at the founding of the East India Company, at the time when Britain developed this claw that would reach out into the rest of the world, India and China were easily, in terms of global production, not only the largest economies, they were the largest share of global production. And so from the 1600s to now, what you've seen, first through the British Empire and now through the US Empire, an aversion, an aberration in human history, an economic imbalance whereby these places are able to advantage themselves through empire building to a different level than has been engaged with before. So now what the United States is trying to do is target states that do not have an integration with the US military. Now, if you look at where the US military bases are, and you look at the countries which do not have US military bases, I am certain you will have a keener appreciation of human rights within those states and a keener understanding of human rights within those states than you would have within states that have US military bases. Because the very same structure which builds up the US military bases in those other states is able to build up informational domination that will repeat the same message again and again and again and again, and actually lessen our ability to truly understand what is happening in those cases. It will simply repeat the same mantra again and again and again. Of course, repression exists. There's no, of course, legitimate grievances exist, as they do in all societies. However, the way that that information is presented, I would say, is dictated by the relationship to US military supremacy within those places. So I don't think it's a moral question. I think it's a question of understanding what the objectives are. If we have the same media organizations that have lied to us about ourselves for this long, and if you take in this country your chances of being anywhere near an act of political violence, okay, according to British military experts, is 1 in 16 million. 1 in 16 million. If you were to look at how many people have been stopped under the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act, you're looking at over 500,000. The way that the issue of political violence in this society is understood can be defined through the words threat inflation. It's about threat inflation. Actually, when you break it down, this is prior to COVID, over 100,000 people were killed, according to Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University. Over 100,000 people were killed. Actually, between 100,000 and 130,000 people were killed due to austerity. You have statistically a higher chance of being killed by austerity than you do by terrorism in this country. Would you say that is the perception of most of the population here?
Absolutely not.
What kind of machinery is in place to give us that perception? The same machinery which is wielded against those that do not have that military integration, for better or worse. I'm not saying that the repression doesn't exist. It does. It's a fact. But what I'm saying is that our perception of it, there's a machine behind producing a particular perception and that perception having value.
So what do you tell those who are facing repression and the only people who voice their concerns are members of that machine who lie about everything else, but they're the only people who can voice their concerns in this particular point. How do they work that out?
So I would say, if you look at the cases of the past, of those that trusted in those actors and what befell them, when the British and US forces left Afghanistan, Eric Prince, the mercenary leader, the founder of Blackwater, was charging people over $6,000 per seat on a plane to exit Afghanistan.
And these people are?
Who's these people? Who were paying for the tickets? I don't know.
Okay.
However, what you did see were Afghans clinging to the bottom of the plane as it took off and falling to their death. What you saw was individuals that worked with the British forces there, particularly G4S, not only do everything they can to leave the country on the basis that they had been part of a regime in Afghanistan which had overseen, statistically, Afghans become the saddest people in the world, statistically speaking. NATO absolutely eviscerated Afghanistan and was still unable to set up the supply lines that it would have wanted for the resources there. Those individuals that worked for G4S guarding the British embassy, G4S blocked them, left, and never spoke to them again. The experience of Libya is illustrative. NATO bombed the country 7,000 times over a period of 6 months on the basis of widening political participation in decision-making, right? That was the basis that the rest of the world was given. We are widening the process of who gets to participate in decisions in the society. What did NATO nations do? They pumped the country full of weapons to the point where, per head, Libya has more weapons than the United States today. Does it have more political freedom? It's a question. It's an open question. And I'm sure there'll be those that would argue either side. However, the lesson of history is that a recognition, or what feels like a recognition of your humanity, is based on a political interest at the time, particularly from the United States government, particularly from machines like NATO, particularly, and the British are good. You know, the British in some ways are actually better than the US. I mean, the US rely a lot on Hollywood, rely on cultural weight, but the British are very adept at presenting themselves as noble intentioned incompetence rather than conniving khubuth, as you would say in Arabic, as conniving conspiracy. But this is the whole basis. British intelligence services conspired against their own Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, just because he was slightly off script with the Americans, Operation Clockwork Orange in the 70s, where the British government actually overthrew its own Prime Minister. So to pretend that these institutions, which are essentially moved by interests and long-term interests, can be moved by emotion is, I would say, is wishful thinking.
Do you believe that people or certain other parties with opposing interests are acting on emotion, or are they also acting in their own long-term interests?
Absolutely, yeah. And we see it today. They're acting on their own long-term interests, absolutely. But there's a a key difference in terms of the British occupied every country in the world apart from 20 or 22. At its zenith, the British Empire reached 14,700,000 square miles of the planet. You learn a lot about management of people. You learn a lot about manipulation of people along that period. Now, while, for instance, in the Chinese context, the one China policy is harsh, undoubtedly, it is a harsh policy. However, it has not gone beyond the only example you have historically of China going to somewhere else was going to Sri Lanka, kidnapping the leader, bringing him back, turning him into a puppet, and sending him back to Sri Lanka. They literally drew back their maritime on the basis that they did not want to expand into the rest. That's the key difference between the Western European civilization as represented by not only the British, but the Gama, Portugal, the Spanish, Columbus, is that they saw industrialization as only being able to be carried out through maritime expansion, through the conversion of other populations into captive labor and the conversion of their resources into free resources and also captive markets as well. It just simply wasn't adopted by the Chinese. Some make the arguments about the Russians in terms of the Soviet Union. I would say it's not the same. It's not the same. You can't compare Patrice Lumumba having good relations with the Soviet Union to US imperialism. It just wasn't the same. Or even especially British Empire. It wasn't the same. The Congo wasn't used as a captive market. Yes, there may have been uneven relations at points, but it just wasn't the same model. It wasn't the same model. And the problem with the US is that the political system is enthralled to the military-industrial complex, which necessitates permanent war. It necessitates the continuous export of weapons and the continuous building of military bases. Other civilizations don't have that. But yeah, it's quite a long-winded answer to your question.
That's okay. I'd like us to touch on another arm of the kind of the manipulatory kind of Western apparatus, the media.
Yeah.
And specifically, I'd like to talk maybe a little bit about Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
I know you get asked a lot about him. And I think recently he asked, or demanded rather, for you to come on his show. And we saw actually as well recently, he took a harsher stance against the Israeli deputy mayor when she came on with regards to innocent civilians being targeted.
Yeah.
Is this an indication that things are changing in the media sphere?
I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely. It's an indication that the reality is it's asserting itself over people who have served as propagandists for all of this during this time. In the case of Piers Morgan, I think it's important to point out something that may not be well known. So what I have here is a list that was compiled by Benjamin Netanyahu and his political office. What you also have here specifically is names with Netanyahu's writing. Now, this was published by Y.net and the Israeli newspaper, one of the well-known newspapers. And here you have names of individuals that were considered by Netanyahu's political office to be funders of his campaign. Now, one name here, there's many names and we can go through them in different ways and the significance they have in this country. But one name here who I think everybody should be interested in is Rupert Murdoch. And he's given the designation of 2. Now, Rupert Murdoch, of course, is an oligarch that controls much of the British media, owns The Sun, owns The Times, owns Sky News, and others. Murdoch historically has funded something called the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds illegal settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. In addition to that, Rupert Murdoch also had a subsidiary called the NDS Group, which was run by former Israeli intelligence and military personnel, which was accused of hacking the communications of its opposition at the time, other media companies. Now, Rupert Murdoch is also, importantly, the owner and the founder of Talk TV, meaning that Talk TV, which has the cartoonishly evil James Whale and his sidekick, also employed Piers Morgan for a period of time. And the time when I went on the channel, the show was on Talk TV, owned by Rupert Murdoch, who is on a list here from Netanyahu's political office, considered to be a funder of Benjamin Netanyahu. In the case of Piers Morgan, more widely, he has appeared at events for a charity in this country called the Norwood Charity, which is headed by Jonathan Mendelsohn, who's the former head of the Labour Friends of Israel, and also headed by Trevor Chin, who's a very key Israel lobbyist, funded Starmer. He's on the executive board of BICOM, which is Israel's largest lobby group in this country, which has a daughter organization, We Believe in Israel, that attempted to remove my music from Spotify. In addition to that, on the 22nd of October of 2023, Piers Morgan met for a sushi meal in New York in the midst of his coverage of the genocide in Gaza with Nicola Mendelsohn and Catherine Jenkins. He's pictured at the table in the sushi restaurant with them. Nicola Mendelsohn is the wife of Jonathan Mendelsohn. She's also lobbied for Israel at Facebook, where she's the head of global advertising. Just so we're clear, during this period of the genocide of Gaza, adverts have been allowed on Facebook calling for a Holocaust against Palestinians. Oh. Adverts have been allowed encouraging Palestinians to leave Palestine and go to Jordan. So the head of global advertising at Facebook, Nicola Mendelsohn, has also met with Shimon Peres, has also participated in Israeli government-supported events. In addition to that, Catherine Jenkins, who Piers Morgan was sitting next to and smiling, has fundraised for the JNF, which is Israel's largest settlement building body in occupied Palestine. So from my perspective, I view it as there being too many conflicts of interest here. You were employed, and at the time you interviewed me, you were employed by a channel that is owned by someone who seems to be a funder of Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah. That's a conflict of interest. In addition to that, he would have filling in for him sometimes, and I was invited on when someone was filling in for him by the name of Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray has a clear historical relationship with the Israel lobby through the Henry Jackson Society. Yeah. He was executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, the founder of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan Mendoza is listed as a director and a president of the JNF, which again is the largest settlement building body in Palestine. There's been a clear revolving door between the Henry Jackson Society and the Israeli military. And on top of that, Douglas Murray was then given an award by Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, for his services to Israel in the media. Would that include the time that he was filling in for Piers Morgan on his show? Serious questions that have to be asked about this incestuous relationship.
Are you aware if, because Piers Morgan left Talk TV, are you aware if he's still connected to Rupert Murdoch?
I do not know the current arrangement, and I do wonder about the reason for the exit. So perhaps that's something more to investigate. But he was employed by Rupert Murdoch for many decades, at different news outlets. Now, who else do we have on this this list of potential funders of Netanyahu? So we have Zach Gertler. Zach Gertler is somebody who donated £100,000 to Michael Gove, the current head of the Ministry for Levelling Up, and somebody who has taken it upon himself to identify several pro-Palestinian organizations in this organization and attempt to smear them with the tag extremist. Who else do we have? Manny Weiss, another individual who has been found to fund Michael Gove. Who else do we have on this list of individuals? Well, we have Eyal Ofer, another funder of Benjamin Netanyahu, it seems, and the head of something called Zodiac Maritime. Now, Zodiac Maritime is a British shipping company which was found to be an arm of Israeli intelligence and was an essential component of assassinations in the region against members of the resistance factions. In addition to that, you have Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is listed here as a possible funder of Benjamin Netanyahu's political campaign. Of course, Trump then, once president of the United States, went on to, quote unquote, recognize Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. What you also have here is Haim Saban. Who is Haim Saban? Haim Saban is an executive director of Universal Music Group. It's the biggest music company in the world, bar none. All of our favorite artists, if they're not signed to Universal currently, they've either been signed to Universal in the past or they have distribution deals with them, including DJ Khaled. So what we're saying is the executive director of the company which owns DJ Khaled's music is listed here as a funder for Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah? With 4 written next to him by Netanyahu. There's many people here who are of importance. For instance, Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner has a place of influence at Harvard University and was considered a key partner to Jeffrey Epstein. You also have Edgar Bronfman. Now, the Bronfman family have a very key role at Warner Music. Who else do you have? Len Blavatnik, another individual with key role at Warner. So, this entire list requires more study for sure. Nasser Khalili, for example, who built the Khalili Lecture Theatre at SOAS University, an art collector, is listed here as a potential funder of Benjamin Netanyahu's political campaign.
This was released by Ynet News in 2009.
Correct, yeah.
But it hasn't made any rounds in any English language media, as far as I'm aware. Why do you think that's the case?
It's a good question. I think possibly because what is seen as standard within media practice is not to publish anything that hasn't been commented on by the people it concerns, especially when you're dealing with powerful political actors. They wouldn't extend that right to yourself or me if they were smearing us as whatever they would choose to smear us.
Right.
But I think that could be part of it. I'll tell you something interesting that followed was Netanyahu approached the children of Rupert Murdoch and asked them to buy this newspaper.
Wow.
A couple of years after this was published. Another interesting figure you have here is Gerald Ronson. So Gerald Ronson is being listed as somebody that may have funded Benjamin Netanyahu. Gerald Ronson is the head of the Community Security Trust in this country. That's an organization that gets tens of millions of pounds from the British government on a yearly basis. Now, when Michael Gove was on the board of advisors for this organization, he was simultaneously the education secretary, and he chose to give £2 million worth of funding to the CST at the same time, despite the conflict of interests that seem apparent. Now, the CST, it's been claimed by Anthony Learman, who used to work with them. He's from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. He asserted even, that CST are trained by Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad. You have current employees of CST who are very prominent, who are former personnel in the Israeli military. Now, the CST has a very significant level of influence in this country. So, for example, when there was the uprising that accompanied Ma'rakat Sayf al-Quds in 2021 within schools, so students came out standing with Palestine, Gavin Williamson, that time the education minister, came out with a statement that in order to deal with the uptick in quote-unquote anti-Semitism in British schools, the schools should use CST. So that's headed by a convicted fraudster, Gerald Ronson, who seems to have been a funder of Benjamin Netanyahu. Surely this is all in the public interest.
This is an indication of how murky the relationships really are. And I wonder what that means in terms of the establishment's future. And if Israel continues down a path in which it becomes a pariah state, and it seems like it might be going down that path, what happens to people like this? What can people do in generally to kind of bring these things to light?
In a way, to be honest, this is part of the reason why I support these people I love, respect and support who are running for parliament. It's part of the reason that I don't view it as a vehicle for meaningful societal change, because Britain is so pinned. It's really a trilateral security state which operates. The level of overlap between the Israelis, the British and the Americans, you cannot discern where one begins and the other ends. There's so many things which Britain outsources to Israel and Israel outsources to Britain. So, for instance, when the police want to hack your phone in this country, they will use Celebrite, which is an Israeli intelligence company headed by former Unit 8200 personnel. For instance, the data which is held by the British Ministry of Defence, the British Foreign Office, the British National Health Service, the British Home Office, is held by a US company by the name of Oracle. What's Oracle? Oracle is so close to the Israelis that Benjamin Netanyahu was offered the directorship of it. It's headed by Larry Ellison, who's one of the biggest funders of settlements and the Israeli military in the history of the Friends of the IDF organization. The same organization, Oracle, handles classified US military databases. So really what you're saying is that this is a trilateral system where constant information sharing and constant working lock in step with each other. As you've seen in Yemen, it's the British and the US that are bombing Yemen in support of Israel. When you see the drones and ballistic missiles that were fired at Israel by Iran, it was the British and the Americans which scrambled to the protection of Israel. So ultimately, you are not going to extricate Britain from that relationship. You can disrupt it, you can make it harder, you can turn the population against it, but you cannot extricate it as a system. And I think that's the key misunderstanding that some of our engagement with the political system has, that we believe there's some way that the fanciful words that they use for diplomacy's sake have substance. International law has meaning. It doesn't. It almost doesn't matter what happens on the political sphere. This is about a military-to-military relationship. Britain and Israel signed a secret agreement several years ago, which we do not know the content of. Britain is sending the R1 Shadow spy plane above Gaza on a daily basis, which can help with targeting, reconnaissance. Britain is, as we speak, sending military jets to Tel Aviv on a daily basis from Akwaturi, the base in Cyprus. It's monitoring the communication of the resistance factions from that base and sharing that information with the Israelis, according to Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan. You have a plethora of ways in which Britain is overlapped in this war. There's direct responsibility for every single death in Gaza. So I think the naive hope that we can extricate Britain from this relationship is a dead end, actually.
So what's the solution in that case?
Again, I've arrived at the point, and again, this is post-Grenfell, this is post all of these policies that I couldn't change, that the best that we can hope for is to make that process more difficult. And that's what Palestine Action is. It's making that process more difficult. It's stigmatizing, it's clarifying, it's polarizing within the vicinity of these factories. It's making sure local people understand what's being done there, so it's harder for that to function. It's getting to it. It's fighting on the micro in order to affect the macro, rather than fighting on the macro in order to affect the micro. You know what I mean?
I see.
And I think that's been quite a change.
It seems to me like the US administration as well as the British administration are refusing to leave the sinking ship that is the Zionist project. So, I mean, one question is, I mean, it does seem like the Zionist project is doomed. Why are they so interested in remaining tethered?
It's a good question. I think historically they've always been tethered. There is somewhat of an emotional connection to the idea of Zionism. You know, you had Lord Palmerston, for example, a sort of a Christian Zionist inflection within the British political elite, which even preceded the development of the Zionist movement. You're talking in the 1800s, early 1800s, 1700s, you had elements of it. But again, I think what's been built up over these decades has been a level of integration which we are quite far from fully understanding the majesty of. Meaning that the integration is massive. And so Israel is simultaneously a settler colonial entity, but it's also, literally speaking, a military base for the United States and a military base for Britain. So through that status within the region, they're able to project influence. But what you're speaking to is interesting, because as the decline of that influence is happening, which is the inevitable course of human history, the return to a more natural equilibrium in the world is the decline and the retreat of US and British influence in that area. Where does that leave Israel? I think Israel is going to be placing a lot of hope in India, as projected to be, you know, by some projections, obviously you have China overtaking the United States as the world's number one economy. Some projections have India overtaking the United States as the world's second largest economy. Now, that process is going to mean that, you know, particularly the BRICS alliance is going to have more of an influence on what does and doesn't happen. And Israel is putting a lot of effort. You know, one of the interesting things about what has happened in this war is at the beginning, after Tawfan al-Aqsa, there was rage on the Israeli side because Ali Baraka from Hamas had come out and said clearly, we have licenses to locally produce Kalashnikovs and bullets for Kalashnikovs from the Russians. He said, we have been told by the Russians that they are going to teach Tawfan al-Aqsa in Russian military schools.
Wow.
The Israelis were enraged about this. And so then in November, they started applying some of the US sanctions onto Russia in the banking sector. What else do you have? You have, you can understand why something like that may have happened, because the Israelis were arming the Azov battalion through Elbit systems with Tavor rifles in Ukraine. So there's a tit-for-tat kind of process possibly playing. The other thing the Israelis did is they stopped informing the Russians before airstrikes in Syria, which previously had been happening. What's the other side of this? The Israelis claim that they found Chinese weapons in Gaza. What else happened? So China begins to operate on Israel what Israel perceives to be and interprets as a sanction regime, where China ceases to send things that can be used for military and civilian use, dual use. So components that Israel could integrate into its weapon systems stopped coming from the Chinese. The Russians are saying, the Israelis are saying, how is that possible? Why is this happening? In addition to that, when Israel cancels the working permits of, the amount of Palestinians that worked daily in Israel, and not just Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, that were essential to the Israeli economy, cannot be underestimated. Even just in the construction industry, you've got 60,000 Palestinian workers there. Okay? They cancel those permits overnight. Who does Israel turn to plug the gap? So first it goes to the Chinese. Now at that stage there were 30,000 Chinese workers in the entity. What happens? 20,000 of them are called home. Only 10,000 of them remain.
Wow.
Israel says to China, send us more. China says no. What else happens? China refuses to condemn Hamas. Israel's furious. What else happens? China has built the Haifa port for the Israelis on the basis that Chinese companies would have significant control of the port.
Right.
What does Israel do? It hands over 70% of the control of the port to an Indian billionaire. So there's, in a way, a shadow war playing out here. But what is significant also is that after the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, we did not see Putin or Xi Jinping at the funeral. Why? So what's happening here? You even look at why is it that the Yemeni armed forces have been able to do what they've done in the Red Sea? Why? It is because China develops the comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, where they say over 25 years, we're going to invest 400 to 500 billion in the Iranian economy. Therefore, we are going to solve the issue between Iran and Saudi Arabia, thus ending the war in Yemen. China does that, the war in Yemen ends. What happens? You have groups in Yemen who are able to assert themselves on the Palestinian issue. This is all interesting. But where does Israel turn to fill the employment gap? Turns to India. The largest armors of Israel in this war, the United States, Germany, Canada, Britain, India.
Wow.
The future does not belong to the United States, Britain, Canada, and Germany. It doesn't. The future, as in the next 50 years, India, China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil. Look at those relationships. Brazil calls it genocide. South Africa calls it genocide. Russia, ambiguous, frankly speaking.
Yeah.
China ambiguous, but ultimately more opposed than others, we can say. That's the future. So Israel is looking at BRICS and thinking, how can we form relationships that can see our way out of this? You know, it would take, what they're attempting is impossible. Many would look at it from the perspective and say, okay, you who are trying to fight against Zionism, you're attempting the impossible. Actually, what the Zionists are attempting is impossible. How are you going to sell this to the rest of the world, let alone to people of the region? They can integrate. You know, the key thing about the Abraham Accords, which I think has been underanalyzed, was it was about integration of economies and militaries. Integration of economies and militaries. I'll tell you 2 key ways in which there's been integration in the region between Israel and Gulf partners. So number 1, the same company Celebrite, which hacks phones for the British police, which is an Israeli company, hacks phones for Pakistani intelligence. Used to hack phones for Russian intelligence prior to Ukraine. Hacks phones for, even the Venezuelans. But also hacks phones for the UAE and the Saudi government. Okay, so in terms of sovereignty, you are outsourcing the surveillance of your own citizens to an Israeli company. It's not just NSO, which is also the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. What it revealed is that normalization has happened. Is this conceivable that a Saudi citizen has his phone hacked by an arm of the Israeli government, which is the NSO group Pegasus for the Saudi government? And you say normalization hasn't happened, but there's more. There's more and it's worse. There's more and it's worse. The UAE has shares in something called Highlander Aviation. Highlander, and when I say the UAE, it's Edge Group, which is a UAE state-owned military company. It is a part owner of Highlander Aviation, which is an Israeli drone company, which manages Israeli airspace. The Saudis set up something with Jared Kushner called Affinity Partners, a hedge fund, which Kushner said, which bear in mind, Kushner, when we step into the Trump and the Netanyahu and Kushner thing, Netanyahu used to sleep in Kushner's room.
Wow.
When he visited the United States. That's how close the families are. So Kushner sets up Affinity Partners. He describes it as a corridor for Gulf investment in Israel. It's a joint project between the Saudi government, the UAE government, and Jared Kushner. What does it own? What does it own? It owns $2 billion worth. No, it owns less than $2 billion. It owns a large portion of something called the Shlomo Holdings Group. Yeah? Now, Shlomo is an Israeli company which builds their ships for the Navy and has also armed the Shaudag unit of the Israeli military since October 7th. That's Saudi money.
Wow.
There's an integration of the military systems in the region off the back of the Abraham Accords. But anyway, we could go on all day, bro. But yeah.
Lowkey, this
unbelievable.
This is really eye-opening. The sheer amount of connections, the web that connects all of these different organizations and administrations to the Zionist entity. I really appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for joining us today, and really hope to have you on later again.
Anytime.
And discuss more.
Anytime.
How deep this goes.
Anytime. Thank you, bro.
Thank you so much.